Okay. Assalamualaikum and a very good evening. First of all, I would like to welcome all of you to our free live webinar on Introduction to HSE Management System, organized by Intensive Energy Sdn Bhd. Okay. First, let me introduce my name first. My name is Shafika, and I am your moderator for today. So before we start, I appreciate if all of you can mute your microphone during this webinar. Okay, before we start our training session, let me just briefly explain to you about our flow for today. First, I will explain to you about our company, and then I will briefly explain to you what are the do's and don'ts during this webinar. After that, I will introduce to you to our speaker. Then we will start our training session, and last but not least, we will go to Q&A session. Okay, let me briefly introduce to you about our company. So, Intensive Energy Sdn Bhd, or known as IESB, it was incorporated in 2012 and accredited with ISO 9001 and 14001. So, we basically specialize in HSE management and consulting services. So, these are 5 of our core businesses. First, for scheduled waste management and consulting, we offer full spectrum of spent catalyst management, such as recovery, recycle, refining, special management, and others for precious metal and transition metal. Other than that, we also offer cradle-to-cradle management and bezel transboundary movement for scheduled waste. Next, for HSE management and consulting, we offer various HSE management and consulting services, such as we have HSE Management System, Chemical Management System, Environmental Monitoring, Indoor Air Quality, CIMA, and others. Other than that, we also offer audit and assessment for hazard and effect management, such as for HAZOP, HAZID, QRA, PHA, and others. Okay, next, for EHSE and IoT solution, we basically digitalize all HSE activities such as monitoring, real-time tracking, and also analytical reporting, all in mobile apps. So if you notice earlier, I have shown you 2 videos. In one of the video, there is example of our digital application, mobile apps, such as we have HSE on the go, we have M Tracker, SWOT Tracker, and others. Okay, next we also have operational excellence product and services. For operational excellence product and services, we are actually the exclusive agent for various principals who have successful technology worldwide. So currently we have about 6 different products from US, Denmark, Italy, and others. Okay, last but not least, for HSE training, we offer various aspects of HSE training, such as we have HSE Management System, we have Chemical Management System, we also have Environmental, we have Risk Management, and also Occupational Safety. So if you have any inquiry regarding any of our core businesses, kindly drop your email to admin@isb.my. Okay, next let me proceed with the do's and don'ts during this webinar. First, kindly mute your microphone to avoid any interruption during the session. Second, please refrain from discussion regarding other unrelated issues during the session. Third, if you have any question, kindly drop your questions in the chat box, and the questions will be entertained during the Q&A session. Okay, next I will introduce to you about our speaker. Kindly watch the video below for the introduction to the speaker.
Hello, I am Ahmad Fahmi Salihuddin. I am the lead trainer for Intensive Energy, a Malaysian company that provides comprehensive HSE training, consultancy and audit programs, as well as innovative products, systems and services for enhancing operational excellence. I am a chemical engineer by profession, and I've worked almost exclusively in the oil and gas and chemical industries over the past 40 years. My work experience includes project management, technical services, sales and marketing, audit, product and business development, as well as operations management. I've worked for multinational companies and government-linked companies, as well as small and medium enterprises. I am an HRDF certified professional trainer and facilitator, and DOSH certified chemical health risk assessor and ergonomics trained person. I'm also a trained quality assurance and health, safety and environment management systems auditor. Finally, I am a competent Toastmaster.
Okay, now without further ado, I pass the presentation to our speaker, Cik Fahmi. So, Cik Fahmi, like the stage is yours.
Thank you, Shafiqa. Assalamualaikum and good afternoon, everyone. I don't suppose I need any further introduction since you were all watching the video. So let's go straight into the webinar or the presentation that I'm going to make today regarding HSE management. If you will follow the if you will follow the the slides, as Shafiqa has said, please reserve your questions. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box and I will attempt to answer them once I finish the presentation. But if you feel that you really have something very important and very urgent to say, then just please put your hand up and we will stop the session and go through your questions. Okay, right then. So we're talking about HSE Management System, where we manage risk through continuous improvement. Why do we want to do this? You know, every business undertaking involves taking risks. There's no such thing as a risk-free operation or business or industry. But the success of the business depends on how effectively and efficiently that risk is managed. And business risk, particularly HSE risk, can be effectively and efficiently managed by utilizing the continuous improvement cycle of PDCA, or plan, do, check and act. The plan part is where you determine the risks that need to be addressed, where you establish objectives and processes necessary to develop the output expected. The do part, obviously, is implementing that plan, as well as capturing the results. Checking is monitoring, reviewing, analyzing the information that you collect from operating your business and comparing the actual result against the expected results. You're always, nobody's perfect, so you always assume that there is a gap in what you expected to do against what you are actually doing. And therefore, you have to act on that gap. Where the results are different, determine the cause. Why is it that you were not able to bridge that gap, or why is that gap present, and determine, and then where it is in the cycle, how to make changes to your operation in order to improve. And this is continuous. Once you've acted, then again you have to look at what your plans are, whether or not you need to change them, determine what the risks are, whether those need to be changed, whether those have changed and therefore need to be addressed again, and so on. So it's a continuous cycle. But at the core of it is determining the risk. So let's just very quickly talk about risk. What is risk? I take the business definition of risk. It is a probability or threat of damage, injury, liability, loss, or any other negative occurrence that is caused by external or internal vulnerabilities that may be avoided through taking preemptive action. Sorry. For the business to succeed, by which I mean for it to achieve its objectives, steps must be taken to continuously improve the management of risk associated with it, whether they are financial or operational or health, safety, or environmental. Now, just stop here a minute and say, please do not confuse risk with hazards. I will address this matter shortly, but a risk is this, the probability or the threat or threat of damage caused by vulnerabilities that must be avoided through preemptive action. What is risk management then? Risk management is basically a continuous cycle of 4 activities. First being identification. What are the risks that your business faces? Then assessment of those risks. What is the severity of the hazard? First of all, what is the hazard that is involved, and what is the likelihood? What is the likelihood of that risk occurring? How severe its impact will be? Then, once you have identified and assessed the risk, you will want to work out what you need to do to reduce the impact of the risk on your business. That is to say, to control that risk. And throughout your operation, you will be monitoring the operation of the business to determine whether or not you are controlling the risks effectively and efficiently, whether or not the situation has changed and therefore new risks are emerging, and what you would have to do. So you continue to identify, assess, control, and monitor over and over again. So let's look at each of those 4 aspects of risk management. First is risk identification. How do you identify a risk? You start, first of all, by defining your workflow. You have to know what your activities are, and in particular, what are the activities that are critical to the success of your operation. Whether it is receiving your goods, processing them, storing them, delivering them, define those activities in terms of how critical they are to the success of your business. Take into account your work environment. Are you physical as well as, for example, other factors such as political or legal? The environment that you're working in. Are you operating in a dedicated industrial area, or are you a workshop that's operating in the middle of a commercial center, or possibly even in a residential area? Are your activities subject to laws of the land, for example? So the environment that you are working in is also a critical part of that definition of the workflow. And finally, your work organization. How do you do things, and in what sequence? Is that sequence specific? Is it unchangeable, or can you work things around? So all those 3 items: what activities are critical, the environment that those activities are being undertaken in, as well as how that work is being organized, will define your workflow. Only then would you be able to identify the risk. And the risk can basically be divided into 4 areas. Number 1 is your process risk, not in terms of how you do things, and it's not just in terms of how you operate, but also how you designed your process. The sequence of, as I said, the sequence of events, the parameters, the operating conditions under which you carry out your work is important when you first design your system. And then how you operate it, whether it is remotely operated or it needs to be hands-on, whether it requires a lot of people or is highly automated. All those risks have to be clearly defined. Second is the hardware risk, which is basically your machinery and your equipment. What you have, your materials of construction, and how you operate them, and so on. The third part is your controls, your control system, not just the hardware, which is, for example, if you're in an industrial environment, your control valves, your piping, and so on, but also your software, how your computers or your systems are managed by software. And finally, the human risk, your workers, the people who work in your operation, as well as the surrounding community. How do they interact with your operation? Those are the 4 main risks that you would have to identify as they relate to the work that you do. And the third part of risk identification, now that you have identified those risks, is what will their impact be? And really, what you'll be looking at is how does your operation impact on the health and safety of the people, not just your workers, but also the immediate community? How does it impact on the preservation of the environment? And how does it impact on the integrity of your assets? That means to say your machinery, your equipment, your building, and so on. So that's how you would identify the risks and say, okay, these are what I'm going to be working with. Next step is prioritizing them, assessing the risk and deciding whether or not those risks is a low risk or a medium risk or a high risk, or perhaps no risk, or worst case scenario, a critical one. How do you assess risk? You normally, what you have to do is to determine the severity of the hazard. How severe is the effect of a particular hazard on people, on environment, on assets? For example, you're using a chemical. A low severity chemical will be something that possibly only just causes irritation of the skin or the eyes if you come into contact with it. Medium hazard, severity of hazard would possibly be a chemical that causes damage to the skin or the eyes or internal organs of your body that may result in you not being able to work, be hospitalized, and require treatment. High severity hazard is something that is possibly fatal if you come into contact with it. Yeah. And then once you define the severity of the hazard, you need to look at the likelihood of exposure. How likely are you to be exposed to the hazard itself? Are you going to be in contact with it for a very short time, for example, for a very short time, or for a very infrequent time? So there are two aspects of exposure. The first is duration. How long are you exposed to that particular hazard? Again, do you work for a few minutes at a time with it, or do you work all day with it? Do you work every day with it, or do you only come into contact with it once a year or even once every 5 years? So that's how you determine whether the likelihood of exposure is low, medium, or high. Usually low means less than once a year for a short time. Medium means probably if you're in contact with it every month or so for maybe 2 to 4 hours. High exposure means you are exposed to that particular hazard throughout the day, possibly every day or even every week. Once you have determined your likelihood of exposure and severity of hazard, then you will be able to determine whether or not you are dealing with high risk or medium risk or low risk, or even hopefully no risk. Yeah. So that's how you do a risk assessment. Once you have assessed the risk, then you determine how are you going to respond to it. There are, generally speaking, 4 ways to respond to a risk, depending again on the severity of hazard or the likelihood of exposure. Let's start at the top. If it is the hazard has a severe impact on your operation and the likelihood of exposure is very high, then you should seriously think about not doing it. Terminate it completely, forget it, do something else, or find a different way to do it, so that you either reduce your likelihood of exposure or you reduce the severity of the hazard. If you feel that you cannot, so that's the first part. That's what we mean by terminate. Terminate means not doing it or doing it in a different way, doing something else. Okay? If there's low likelihood of exposure and a high severity hazard, you may want to think about transferring the risk. Transferring means asking someone else to do it, outsourcing it. Yeah? So that you don't have to expose your own people or your own community to the hazard, but ask someone else to deal with it. For example, if your operation generates a lot of waste, you can say, okay, I need to treat that waste before I can before it leaves the factory. Or you can say, there are companies who are better equipped to deal with that waste. So you contract it out to someone, to a company that has that capability to do it. That's what we mean by transferring the risk away from your own operation to somebody else's operation. If you have a high likelihood of exposure, but the hazard is not so severe, then you say, okay, I will take the necessary measures to reduce that risk, to treat it so that it is tolerable. And that's where we come to the last one, which is where the likelihood of exposure is low and the severity of the hazard itself is also low. And you say, okay, I can work with that. It's fine. So your primary objective in HSE management is, in terms of response to the risk, is to bring it down into this bottom left-hand corner where you are able to tolerate the risk in expectation of achieving your business objectives. And this is where the control system comes in. So you have this is what is known as a hierarchy of controls. There are basically 6 control aspects that you can apply to risk. The most effective, as I said earlier, is that you terminate it, eliminate the risk by not doing it at all. Yeah, remove that hazard, remove your exposure to it, and you're done. No risk. If you say that cannot be done without affecting our business objectives, then look to replace that hazard by substitution. Instead of using, for example, instead of using a highly corrosive chemical, use a less corrosive one. Instead of operating at very high temperatures, instead of operating a reactor at very high temperatures, add a catalyst so that you can reduce the temperature and the pressure of the system, and therefore reduce the risk of the reactor blowing up. That's what, yeah. You can also reduce the hazard by instituting engineering controls. For example, protection systems. For example, storage systems, intermediate storage systems, so that you don't transfer, for example, hot materials from one area to another. You put it into a storage silo to let it cool down before it moves on to the next operation, and so on. Those are what are known as engineering controls, where you are looking to isolate the hazards or segregate them. It's not just physical isolation. You may, for example, look at how you organize your work, your activities, and say, okay, the more hazardous activities you would do at a time when there are fewer people in the plant. So, for example, yeah. So if you're operating 24 hours a day, you can say, I want to run my critical equipment only at night. Or reverse, if you say, okay, it's safer to do things only during the day, say fine, I only allow work to be done, this kind of work to be done in the daytime, when everybody is alert and there's plenty of light and so on, and I will shut down the plant at night. I will not allow work to be done at night, regardless of the fact that you may have lighting and ventilation and so on. So that's what we mean by elimination, substitution, and engineering control. These are more towards controlling the hazard itself. And then you come down, if you can do that, then that's fine. You reduce the risk considerably. If you cannot control the hazard, as you say, if you know you have to live with them, then you look at how to control your exposure to them. So promote awareness through signage, through training, and so on. Yeah, administrative controls where you have where you manage behaviors. Not, what do you mean by that? I mean by instituting procedures and instructions and supervision so that people know that this is how you must do your job. No more, no less. Yeah, managing behavior. And finally, you say, okay, if I've put all of these controls in place and yet there is still a fairly high residual risk, then you say you have to wear protection, personal protective equipment. So, I mean, example of what it is in COVID-19, in the movement control order that we've been experiencing for the last 3 months. Yeah, elimination, removing the hazard. How does that translate into COVID-19? Basically, it says that stay at home. Stay at home means you do not come into contact with COVID-19. So you remove the hazard from your life. Substitution, replacing that hazard. You see, you know, for example, if you say, oh, I used to have to go shopping to buy my clothes, to buy my food, and so on. Now, what do? You order, and it gets delivered to your door. That's what we mean by substitution. Yeah? Engineering controls, you say, if you have to go out, then make sure you go out to an area where there is very good ventilation, whether it's outdoors, or if you have to go into an indoor area, then you say it has to be air conditioned. It has to have a regular cleaning system in place, and so on. Only then would I feel safe in terms of being isolated from the hazard. Then exposure control is actually example warnings. There are warnings that says, okay, if you're going to go to a certain place, you must make sure that that place is blocked off, like you had in the extended MCO, where they even put barbed wire around the area. That is a warning. Said, do not come in here. Yeah. Administrative controls, where you manage behavior, we've been inundated with not suggestions, but instructions on what we need to do. You cannot travel, you cannot go to work, you cannot balik kampung. All those are procedures and those are plans that are put in place to reduce the risk of contact with the COVID-19. And finally, if you still have to go out, you still have to do whatever you need to do, and you want to risk getting into contact with the COVID-19 virus, fine. Wear PPE. Make sure you have a face mask on, you have eye protection, you wear clothing that covers your skin, you use sanitizers, and so on. So that's how hierarchy of controls will work applied to our movement control order, or our fight against the COVID-19 virus. I hope you're with me so far. So these are the hierarchy controls, and that leads us to the HSE Management System, because that's what the HSE Management System is. It is the control framework. These are the systems that you put in place to control your risk, whether it is, sorry, I go back to this, whether it is to eliminate the hazard or substitute it, or put the engineering controls in, or your awareness training, your procedures and your plans, and finally your PPE. That's what your HSE Management System is. And it comprises 8 elements. That's this is, I suppose, one of the ways. I'm not saying this is the only one, yeah, the only management system, but this is the management system that we are promoting and that has found use particularly in the oil and gas and chemical industries. The HSE Management System structure comprises 8 elements, and this is how they roughly relate to or correspond to the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. So first of all, you have your policy and strategic objectives. Then you have your organization, responsibilities, resources, standards, documents. Those are all part of your planning cycle. Okay. Then the do part. These are where you manage your hazards and effects, where you install your plans, your operating plans and procedures and instructions, and so on. And then your implementation of the operation. The check part is obviously what you do to find out what's going on. So when you do your audit, when you do your management review, and actually your monitoring. And the act part is where, based on your audit results and your monitoring results and your management review, you start to take corrective action. And corrective action is done either by amending your plans and your procedures or reviewing your hazards and effects that you have already decided is how you're going to operate your plan. So this is how your plan, your HSE Management System control framework relates to the PDCA continuous improvement cycle. By doing this, by following this, you will continuously improve your management system by your operation. Yeah, your business objectives drive your whole operation in terms of what it is that you want to do and how you want to do it. So from the objectives, you will develop your policies that set the direction and the commitment that you make towards HSE. Only after you have set your objectives and you have determined what your policies are going to be, will you develop your HSE management system, which is the framework of elements that operationalizes your policies to hold up the HSEMS, to actually make sure that it works and that it is doing what it's supposed to do. You have to have your tools for implementation, which are the standards, the plans, and the procedures. Yeah? And once you have your standards, your plans, and your procedures, your implementation tools, you have to maintain that documentation and your records to show evidence of performance, whether that performance is adequate or not, whether it leaves, how big a gap it leaves between actual and expected results. So this is how you have to start developing your HSE management system. Basically, as I said, you start with hazards and effects management. With the hazards and effects, based on the policy and strategic objectives that you have defined and the organization that you have set up. You know, you've done your hazards and effects management. Only then can you produce your plans and your procedures, and then you implement those plans and procedures and monitor them. You conduct audits and you do a review. When you have implemented your system or your operation and you're monitoring them, any corrective action that you take will be to review and amend your plans and your procedures, and or to go back and redo your hazards and effects management. When you do an audit, then that relates to changing your procedures as well as your organization. And when you do a review, that is where you have to look at whether or not your policies and your strategic objectives are, in fact, what you how they define. So that's relationship between the 7 elements, element 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 of the HSE management system. And I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
If you don't have any question, please drop your question in the chat box below.
Okay, how do I get to the chat box?
Encik Fahmi, we have 3 questions for Ms. Shaima Yunus.
Sorry, I need to get. Can somebody help me here? I need to get back to the end slideshow. Okay.
Fahmi, we have 3 questions for Ms. Shaima Yunus. Okay, I will read the question here.
Okay.
The first question is, do the policy and the HSE objective need to be documented in a proper document?
Okay, where is it? Yeah. Sorry, where? Sorry, again the question.
The first question from Ms. Shaima Yunus is, do the policy and HSE objective need to be documented in proper document?
Oh yes. Your HSE policy or the HSE policy of the company and the HSE objectives of the company need to be documented and need to be displayed. There are some companies who even what do you say, staple the HSE policy and the HSE objectives of the company to the payslip. So every month, when people get their payslip, they get reminded of the policy and the objectives of the company with regard to HSE. The thing is, you can do this for as long as you you need to ensure that everybody is aware and say to the point where they can say, okay, somebody asks you, do you know what they do? It's not just a question of do you have an HSE policy? Do you know the HSE policy of the company? So yes, it does need to be documented in a proper document that has to be disseminated to everyone in the organization, so that they become aware and they can actually articulate it. Yeah. All right.
Okay, for second question, can you explain more about the framework of elements to operationalize?
Well, as I said, the framework, the framework of elements are those 8 elements. They start with leadership. I finished, but actually it starts with leadership and commitment, followed by policy and strategic objectives, the organization and the resources and competencies and so on, the HEMP process, the plans and procedures, the implementation and performance monitoring, the audit and assurance, the management review. If you look at so that's the framework, that's the control framework. With what you have to do is actually essentially produce. I say again, back to your first question, produce a document that says this is my HSE management system, and it will specify, okay, what are the requirements, how is the leadership committed to HSE, what are the policies and objectives of the company. But you have the organization structure, you have the job descriptions, roles, responsibilities, and authorities. You have all the standards that you are going to comply with, whether they are the ISO standards or whether they are industry best practices or they are regulations that you have to follow to operate in the country. For example, there are DOSH has issued it's not just the requirements of the Act, but also the regulations that they produce in terms of handling of chemicals or reporting of incidents. There are codes of practice for dealing with how you do your work. There are guidelines and so on. And then there's, of course, the DOE has its own regulations as well. In terms, if you are a company that's licensed by DOE, then you have to meet certain of the regulations and so on. So all those have to be documented. And so you would end up with I would say, an HSE MS manual that defines exactly how those 8 elements relate to the way you do your work. Okay. Next one, I'm reading. Changing managerial position. It is HSE critical position. Do we have? Yes. As I said, if it is an HSE critical position and you're changing that position, I'm saying, if you mean if you're changing the job description or you're changing the person. If you're changing the person, but the job description remains the same, then it is not absolutely necessary to do an MOC because you're doing a like for like. But if you are changing a managerial position and there's nobody who can do the job or has the qualifications to do the job that the person leaving has done, then you have to look again and say, okay, how do we deal with this? Do we have to change the way things are done? Do we have to increase the number of people? Do we have to provide additional equipment and so on? So yes, as I said, if it is like for like, that means you're not changing anything. You're just getting if I can demonstrate this to you in this pyramid, the same experience and qualifications and certifications and so on, then no, you don't have to do an MOC. Okay. Next question, Zuhairi, per ISO 45001 requirements. Okay, yes, I can just very quickly go through. If you go through ISO 45001, they have there are elements in ISO 45001 that cover leadership and commitment, organizational health and safety policy and objectives. Section 5.1 leadership and commitment. 5.2 is occupational health and safety policy. 6.2 is OHS objectives. Clause 5.3 talks about organizational roles, responsibilities, and authorities. 7.1 says tells you that you need to have the necessary resources. 7.2 competencies. 7.3 awareness. 7.4 communication. 7.5 documented information. As far as HEMP is concerned, clause 6.1 of ISO 45001 says you must define the actions that you need to take to address risks and opportunities. That's your hazards and effects management. Clause 8.1 and 8.2 refer to operational planning and control as well as emergency preparedness and response. Clause 9.1 covers monitoring, measurement, analysis, and performance evaluation, which is implementation monitoring. 10.2 talks about incident, non-conformity, and corrective action. Clause 9.1 talks about internal audit, so refers to audit and assurance element. And clause 9.3 talks about management review. Clause 10.3 says you must have a system for continual improvement. So the answer is yes, the HSE MS actually dovetails very nicely into ISO 45001. So if you are planning to achieve ISO 45001 standard, you can do very well to install an HSE management system in the first place. Okay. How do we know, Ms. Shaima? How do we know what are the complementary HSE procedures that need to be developed? Based on HEMP, yes. For critical activities only, as I said tadi, your HEMP is the tools and techniques that you use for HEMP will produce a critical activities catalog. Based on those critical activities, you would then develop the plans and the procedures and the implementation monitoring systems that govern that particular activity. Okay, and yes, you can focus only on your critical activities, but you must be clear that they are critical. With the rest, if they are not, then it's not. Again, if they are not critical activities, then it's not critical to have the management system to manage those activities. It'd be nice if you can do it, then you should. Okay, Ms. Shakila, the company has a safety policy, safety health committee, conducts CHRA, does noise monitoring, etc. Is considered as an HSE. Well, yes, but it's not complete. Yeah, the safety policy, yes, complies with the element of policy and strategic objectives. Safety and health committee is part of the organization, and if it does a management review, then yes, we conduct CHRA, does noise monitoring, etc. That is part of your HEMP process, and that will in turn. But it's what you do with the assessment report. You said you then have to actually, as I said earlier, you then need to review your plans and your procedures and the implementation of those plans and procedures to ensure that you are operating safely. Yeah. So partial, yes. If you have safety policy, you have your safety committee, you do all these assessments and so on, then you are well on your way to having a management system. The important part is to ensure that you actually do have a means of doing something about it, or as you say, review and act on it, so that you keep improving. So I think that's about it. If you want to know more, we are going to conduct a full training program on HSE management system, where we will go into these things in much more detail and help you to produce an HSE management system manual. So with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for your attention, and I hope I've answered all most, if not all, of your questions. And I look forward to talking to any of you again. So with that, I hand over control back to the moderator, Shafiqah.
Okay, thank you, Cik Fahmi, for your sharing. Okay, let me display. Okay, these are the HSE related training for the PDCA starting from July until September. And as you know, we have free webinar on 17, Introduction to HESOP. For the link, you can get the link in the chat box. Our admin already shared the link. So if you have inquiries of any of the training schedule, you can drop your email to trainingforyou@isb.my. For the full schedule, we will email to you together with a slide for the training. So thank you everyone. I hope all of you gain a lot of knowledge from this session. So we hope to see you again on our next session, which is on 17. So thank you and have a nice day everyone.